When recessions happen, the entrepreneurs are actually the people who pull them out of it.
Welcome to the BetaKit podcast. I'm Rob Kennedy, and Douglas is not here this week, and we're speaking again with Michael Freeman, founder of Econa, the global center of excellence for entrepreneur mental wellness, based out of San Francisco. We had Michael in on February of 2021, right at the heart of the endless pandemic, and what I love talking to him about is he's both a psychiatrist and an entrepreneur and understands the needs of the entrepreneur, which is a rarity. Today, we focus on, well, the opposite of February 2021, a bearish economy, war, layoffs in the tech sector for the first time in a decade, and a waning pandemic. Let's talk again about mental health. Michael, thanks for joining us today. We last spoke, believe it or not, in February of 2021. Can you believe it? And the focus then was on founders and mental health and how they intersect, and how you proved mathematically that entrepreneurs really do think differently. So listen to that show if you want some math equations, for better and for worse. And at that point, we were, I think, deep into the never-ending or the seemingly never-ending pandemic. You had just created Econa, the global center of excellence for entrepreneur mental wellness.
That's aspirational, but that is in fact what we did.
That's awesome. So let's get started here. Let's catch up, because we're at a different time now. People at least seem mentally over the pandemic. The tech ecosystem is way different than it was a year and a half ago. So I guess the first question is, what have you seen over the last year and a half since we've talked? Anything interesting?
The prevalence of mental health issues has really increased over the course of the pandemic. And even if now that we're pulling out of the pandemic, a lot of the residual distress is still there, and people's lives have been quite disrupted and restructured, actually. And then there has been an economic turnaround that has affected the startup community and the entrepreneurship community, in that capital is not as easily available as it was the last time that we spoke. So on top of the pandemic, many companies have had to downsize, right-size, abandon initiatives and projects, and valuations have decreased, which has had a ripple effect on the willingness of people to start companies right now and the motivation of risk-bearing team members to continue being part of the team in these startups. Having said that, entrepreneurs have a unique way of looking at situations, and many are not deterred by things that would deter you and me. So where some people see challenge, others see opportunity. That is the case in recessions. That is the case in economic downturns. That is the case in conflict situations. And so the irrepressible entrepreneurs have not been fully repressed. They're still out there. There's still energy bubbling up from the ground level.
For a bunch of people, the last, let's say 12 years since the last recession has been up and to the right. So people who've started their careers in the tech industry, which has blossomed in the last, social media didn't really exist 10 to 12 years ago, like Twitter and Facebook were new. All of these things that didn't exist now exist. Plus, salaries were always up and to the right. Money was cheap, both from a investor perspective and an entrepreneur perspective, but all the employees was like, I could just buy whatever I want. And now we're kind of going back to something that I remember when I was a little younger. Does that play into this at all, the longevity of the upswing, and that's all folks have known? Or is that this is just yet another cycle, do you think?
Both, especially for the younger entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurs tend to be younger in general. And the early stage companies, seed stage companies, are even more frequently started by people in their 20s and 30s, whereas the serial entrepreneurs tend to be in their 30s and 40s. And there's actually a reasonable number of people who are starting second and third companies in their 50s. Out here in the San Francisco Bay Area, I'm trying to convince my local business journal to start a new program called 60 over 60 for the entrepreneurs in that age bracket as well. But for the younger entrepreneurs, yes, it's definitely an adjustment. Your mind is kind of wired to imagine that tomorrow will be more or less like today was, when there are these abrupt changes. Then all of your assumptions no longer make sense. So that really is an issue.
Do you see a difference in the cohorts? Like if you're talking to the 60, my LinkedIn is top 90 under 90. That's my aspiration, for the record. Do you find those folks who have been entrepreneurs a few times before, who have seen one or two or three downturns, depending on your age, do you see a difference in the attitude or approach?
I do, yes. It's not as catastrophic.
For the young ones are catastrophic. The old ones are
For
like,
the young ones, it's more catastrophic. The emotional roller coaster of entrepreneurship. It's like, we're killing it. It's great. It's awesome. It's out of the park. Oh my God, we're imploding. We're going to run out of runway. This thing is going to crash. So these extreme interpretations of external events are more prevalent among the younger entrepreneurs. The older ones have been around the block a few times, and they know that you have ups and downs, and good days and bad days. If you have to close your business, like for example in the pandemic, a lot of retail companies, businesses simply had to close. Irregardless, there's so many disruptive technologies out there that good companies that have been around for a while often have to just fold up shop because they are obsolete. And I can give you a very personal example. I am, as you know, among other things, a psychiatrist. All of my clients are entrepreneurs, so I'm a psychiatrist for entrepreneurs. And I have a lovely psychiatric office in beautiful Marin County, California, just across the Golden Gate Bridge to the north of San Francisco, where I was busy all day long before the pandemic. Then, just as the pandemic exploded on the world, collaboration software platforms like Google Meet and Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Skype and all these other ones also rapidly gained traction. And these collaboration software platforms are a profound disruptive technology. And as a result, nobody wants to come to my office anymore. I would say at least half of the people I work with could easily drive to my office, and some percentage of them could walk to my office. But they'd rather meet on Zoom. Now, it's not only that my quaint, anachronistic psychiatric private practice was disrupted by this. Office buildings were also disrupted. My office happens to be a medical office building. They cannot get anybody to move in. And similarly, in downtown San Francisco, you've got these, massive vacancy rates. I'm sure it's the same in Toronto. So remote work is another factor that was kind of a permanent change in the way we live our lives that kind of resulted from the pandemic in the context of these new software platforms.
We did a show in the early days. So Shopify, as you know, pretty big Canadian company. Very early, Toby, the founder and CEO, was like, "Hey, that's it. No more physical offices. We're a virtual company. You can come into the office, but we're a virtual company." And I was like, "Yeah, that'll last. We'll see how long that lasts." At least we've observed in this ecosystem that because of Zoom and because of the ability to kind of work anywhere, first of all, a lot of US companies have started opening up office here because it's cheaper to have employees here and they're equally intelligent. But also, the company that we ran and sold recently, the switching costs are zero. Basically, everything is the same except for the human in the two-dimensional monitor behind me. But I get to sit in the same desk on the same day. And if Joe Schmo, 1,000 miles away, wants to give me a job that pays $50 more, still checking code into GitHub. It's just a different color now. Obviously, that's altered behavior and the way that people approach work. I've personally found, as I'm helping other companies recruit at the moment, that I'm talking to people and I'm like, "Hey, do you want to talk about this opportunity?" And they're like, "Nope." I'm like, "But don't you just want to talk about the opportunity, just like to see?" And I would have thought the existential crisis that came along with the pandemic would have left, but it doesn't seem to have. Is that what you're seeing as well?
In a variety of ways, yes. And I do think that it's related to being on the screen, particularly in the startup world, because startups are driven by small teams. And the small teams work together very closely. They're in each other's space. They are problem solving, they're testing and iterating. And the close proximity is a really important part of that. And it's important for reasons you might not think about, like pheromones. Pheromones, if you never heard of them, are basically smell related chemicals that we all are emitting all the time. And they signal a lot of things related to emotion and relationship and social connection to the other people that we're sharing space with. And there's also other subtle nonverbal signals like the dilation of your pupils. I can see you perfectly well on this platform right now, but I have no idea if your pupils are getting larger or smaller. And you would be typically logging that in unconsciously. And in startups, the interaction among team members is critically important. Individuals do not win, teams win. The way you can think of it from the perspective of anthropology is that humans were designed to be hunter-gatherer nomads. And we lived in these small groups of anywhere from 25 to 150 people. That was your world for your entire life. And maybe every 5 or 10 years, you'd bump into another tribe out there. And that was all that you knew of other people. Well, the economy, as I said, was based on hunting and gathering. And hunting was done in small groups, in parties. Humans are pretty useless as hunters unless they're in a team where they can coordinate and act strategically and have different roles. The way I look at the startups is that the smaller, the early stage, seed stage startups are about the same size as a hunting party, and they have about the same role in the economy. They're supposed to go out and take really big risks and walk over, go over the ridge that you never went over before and find out if there's like lots of buffalo there. Many times they never come back, but when they do come back, the tribe is in a really good place because there's tons of buffalo. Well, those hunting parties are bonded together with this neurotransmitter hormone called oxytocin and another one that's called endorphins. Oxytocin and endorphins are just really hard to stimulate when you're on a screen. It can be done, but it happens much more easily in the context of being in a real group. So those are tight teams, and they're teams that kind of unify around a mission, and they develop a kind of a leadership structure and a cadence that makes them more effective. I lead a small team. We're trying to do something to improve entrepreneur mental health, and we're completely remote. So I'm just like everybody else. And every once in a while, we all decide to go to the beach and have a picnic together. And I'm telling you, that's our hybrid work solution. It makes a huge difference.
It's funny because it occurred to me as the pandemic was wearing on, I'm like, the reason why it attacks us, the virus attacks us the way it attacks us, is because that is what we are. We're social animals. Of course, it attacks us that way because that is the way, it is the fundamental mechanism by which humans operate. So, of course, that's the vector it attacks you. And of course, that's why we can't do the thing that we like. So, for those entrepreneurs who are starting or in those small buffalo squads,
the hunting parties,
what do you do? Because especially because teams now are scattered across continents and countries, they don't necessarily co-locate, or certainly not contemporaneously.
Yeah.
What do you do? I'll come to your beach party for the record, but that's not,
okay.
That doesn't scale.
But it does improve your mental health.
Yes.
The best strategy I've seen so far was cooked up by Mark Benioff, the founder of Salesforce. He and his leaders came up with was the idea of accept reality. People just don't want to come back to the office. You can't really fight the tide. So Salesforce is famous for having the most prominent office building, in this city and that city all around the world. Well, that game is over. So give up on the office building concept. Empower people to work at home as effectively as they possibly can. And instead of buying office buildings now, Salesforce is buying resorts. And what they're doing is that they're bringing people to resorts for initiative rollouts and team building and strategic planning. And you can go to the resort and your family can go to the resort and get your work family thing, and you can get your commune with nature and physical activity. And I think that's kind of a brilliant hybrid strategy. Now, other entrepreneurs I'm working with have come up with other strategies. A common solution is everybody's in the office on Tuesday and Thursday, or Team A is in the office on Tuesday and Thursday, and Team B is in the office on Monday and Wednesday. I have seen people restructure the way time works so that all meetings happen between 11:30 a.m. or let's say 1 p.m. and 4 p.m. is for meetings. And then the morning is when you actually get work done. And then they encourage people to have meetings outdoors. So there's outdoor meeting venues for that kind of thing. So those are some of the solutions, but I think it's going to be something of that nature, and we just have to figure out how to make it work.
It's interesting, isn't it? It feels like we're not at the end of whatever that is. We're kind of in the middle. I'd be interested to see whether it like rolls out to be a one size fits all type of thing, or is it going to be, as you say, like sort of heterogeneous, and it sort of depends on the culture of the company and their budgets. I'd love to buy a resort for my team, but next week, my money's all in Bitcoin because I think that's going to be the future. I'm curious. You've been practicing for a while, and why we wanted to have you on in the first place, the first time, is you occupy that space, which I think is really cool and pretty much doesn't exist as far as I can tell on the planet, which is you are an actual psychiatrist and you actually can coach entrepreneurs. And I find that I think the conversation we had last time was, when my psychiatrist gives me business advice, I listen or don't. I hope he's not listening, as I said last time. And then, but when my coach would give me, or my whatever you want to call that role, the business coach, the person who's advising you, gives you psychological advice. That's when I'm like, that's kind of dangerous. That's no good. So you've been doing this for long enough that I think you've been around at least for the last recession.
The last two.
Last two. Yeah, that's basically me too. What do you see in these? So it's clearly going to be down for a while, maybe a year, maybe 6 months, maybe 2 years. Nobody knows exactly, but it'll be sucky for a while. What is the pattern that you see with entrepreneurs during this period? Once they've gotten over okay, this is going to suck. Is it 2 years of self-flagellation? What happens?
There are a couple of different trajectories. I would call one trajectory duck and cover, and the other is fight back. I refer to entrepreneurs as economic first responders. And entrepreneurs are wired like first responders in many ways, including the high prevalence of ADHD and novelty seeking, stimulus seeking, thrill seeking, all that kind of stuff. When recessions happen, the entrepreneurs are actually the people who pull them out of it. So this is a very good time. If you happen to be a government, this is a very good time to be kind to entrepreneurs, because they are the ones who are going to see the new opportunities and create the new jobs. In the last recession, literally the 2007 recession, 80% of net new jobs were created by companies less than 5 years old. So those are the ones who are fighting back. And there will be opportunities which will be discovered. But then there's also the duck and cover people, and those people might get a job for a while, or might do projects that are not exactly entrepreneurship, but are like safer bets.
Our market, the Canadian market, mirrored obviously the US market in terms of its slamming on the brakes. We have less capital and we have less number of investors, both at the angel, the seed, Series A, and so on and so forth. And so we lost, or it's not clear whether we're going to have as much fundraising resources here in Canada that we did before. But I find that most entrepreneurs in Canada worth their salt look at the planet and find where the right sources of capital are and the right alignment is. I think, generally there's this weird principal agent problem. At least I think there's a principal agent problem with the investor and the entrepreneur, where the investor has 20 bets or 10 bets and the entrepreneur has one, and riding the entrepreneur to smush out something. If they lose, entrepreneur loses everything, but I'm not saying that in a mean way, but the entrepreneur is all or nothing and the investor has 9 more to go. And what happened, and we covered this when it happened, it was like all of a sudden in unison, all the investors were pushing really hard. All the entrepreneurs are saying, actually, you should conserve your capital, and maybe we're not going to do some new investments. We might do a follow-on round, but let's just see. That's the only thing we're doing. We're doing follow-on, not net new. I know you focus on entrepreneurs, but they're directly coupled with the behavior and the herd and individual behavior of investors. How do you counsel the entrepreneur to think about that end? Because I've seen you talk about that.
And also, how do I talk to the investors?
That's
because
if you do, then yes.
I do. I talk to investors all the time. With the entrepreneur, the conversation is kind of about reality testing and using good judgment and not having wishful thinking, not relying upon strong imagination, believing data, that kind of thing. And just because you have money in the bank, that doesn't mean you have to spend it. Having a runway is a good thing. There's this theory out there in Silicon Valley that if you really have a breakthrough idea, you should just throw a ton of money at it, light it on fire, and get it into the ecosystem and take advantage of, first mover advantages and disrupt. But that's not necessarily a great strategy because companies don't necessarily win on the basis of the product. It's really, like I said, it's the team. I remember back in the days, there are many examples of the best product doesn't win. It's really the best team wins. The best team can market and commercialize and distribute and form strategic alliances and survive, whereas the compelling product doesn't necessarily make it. I always try to encourage people to not bet their last dollar. If you think that you need to take out a second mortgage on your house in order to get your company to the next level, I would be concerned about that. And I literally have talked with a number of founders who have gotten divorced because they did exactly that. Then the revenue didn't come in, and then they couldn't pay off the mortgage, and then the marriages broke up, and there's kids involved. So be prudent. You're right in what you said about the portfolio theory of investors, that the relationship between investors and entrepreneurs is grossly asymmetrical. In my mind, it's also very similar to the relationship between producers and talent in Hollywood. There are a million stars, there's a limited number of studios. And the star is risking, the actor is risking everything, and the studio is looking down a list of which actor is available on these dates and what's their likelihood of collecting a few eyeballs. For anybody listening to this podcast as a founder, one of your strengths that is also a liability is called risk propensity. Last time you and I spoke, we talked about how entrepreneurs have these different personality traits. It's the neurodiversity. And risk propensity is a personality trait that's very, very elevated among entrepreneurs. So you need to outsmart your own brain and not over risk, not take too much risk. You can take way more risk than most other people are ever willing to do, but don't bet the farm. That's kind of my rap to the entrepreneurs. They sometimes don't like hearing it, but if you talk to a serial entrepreneur or people who've had good exits, they will tell you how important a role luck played in their outcome. And the same is true in reverse. When companies fail, it's often for reasons having to do with luck. Literally, one of my patients once upon a time he's an entrepreneur, but his father was also an entrepreneur. And the father's company was about to IPO and on 9/11. And there was this catastrophe. They shut down the stock markets. And the company ultimately failed very quickly after that because they were counting on public markets for access to capital. So don't underestimate the impact that luck can have, and then adjust your sales accordingly.
All right, this next sponsor doesn't need a full ad to tell you that hybrid work is not going anywhere, making employee experience all the more important. Good thing Gsoft and its family of software products have you covered. Like literally, you can Google them, Gsoft, that's Gsoft. But don't Google them until the episode's over. Save it for lunch, read about them while you're having a sandwich, or whatever else you eat. I don't know, I'm not a lunch expert. Neither is Gsoft, but they're darn good at employee experience. So check them out on your lunch break at gsoft.com. Gsoft. Breaking news, SaaS North is back. Our friends at SaaS North are reconnecting the SaaS ecosystem on November 16th to 17th in sunny Ottawa. But here's the thing. Early bird tickets are only available until October 13th. So rush right now to saasnorth.com/register and use code BetaKit25 for an additional 25% off your early bird ticket. And we will see you at SaaS North in November.
You're saying you also speak to investors on the investor side. Is there some like a persona or a style that you see there that you're like, hey, this is how you look at the world? Think about it this way, just as you do with an entrepreneur.
And again, there are a couple of archetypes with that. Unfortunately, the majority archetype are people who are looking for the 10x returns and the home runs, are interested in the entrepreneurs to the extent that it's a pathway to having a successful outcome for the fund. That's one archetype. The other archetype I would characterize as the more compassionate investor. These are investors who tend to care about the entrepreneurs more as people. Sadly, on either side of that equation, in my opinion, the investors way underinvest in mental health for the entrepreneurs. If you look at the use of funds for a Series A, for example, a lot of it's going to go to lawyers, and a lot of it's going to go to consultants, and a lot of it is going to go to branding people and all these external supports. But none of it is allocated for the well-being of the founder and the risk-bearing founding team members. What I try to tell investors is that, well, our data clearly shows that there's a clear relationship between business outcomes and mental health conditions. If you're depressed and you lose your motivation and life is not fun anymore and you don't get any pleasure out of work, it's very unlikely you're going to inspire your company to move the ball forward. So what I try to tell investors is that the data is pretty clear, and it's also intuitively easy to recognize that there's a direct relationship between the mental health of the entrepreneur and the performance of the company. And at a higher level, the investor I spoke to this week, their firm has 75 companies in their portfolio. So if you think about a very modest assumption that kind of a reasonable investment in mental health for entrepreneurs will improve portfolio outcomes by 2%, 1%, 5%. When you get to that scale, you're talking about millions of dollars. The cost of investing in mental health for the entrepreneurs to the investor is really marginal compared to the returns. But nonetheless, they're playing with house money on that. The way venture capital firms are structured is that the money in the fund goes to the entrepreneurs, and then they have to use their fees and stuff to pay for administrative costs. And they just don't want to go out of pocket. They ultimately are quite cheap. So I've had conversations with investors about putting into the Series A agreements budgets for mental health. There are innovative ideas out there that can be done. I don't get a lot of traction. I keep trying. I don't get a lot of traction.
But is it like, Series A, you're investing, well, who knows what it is in 2022 at this point, but there's millions of dollars, and having a psychiatrist for your key employees is not even a line item in that. Do you
exactly.
even need to even, it's up to the founders to say, I am investing in this. No? Do they have to even get the investors involved, or is it just calling it out so the investor says, no, I'm telling you this is important, and that's why you want it as a line item?
All of the above.
Okay.
And many of the entrepreneurs I have worked with over the years are people that just got Series A or Series B funding, and they have been, promoted to the level of incompetence, and now they're really, anxious. But to have those compassionate investors endorse it is very helpful because of shame and stigma. People in our culture are a little reluctant to reach out for mental health support because it's been very badly branded throughout history by a culture that looks at it as a moral failing or an admission of weakness or something like that. So when you have investors who understand that mental health differences and entrepreneurship are two sides of the same coin. By the way, I'm an investor now, but I wasn't an entrepreneur before. And let me tell you my sad story of broken families and addiction rehabs and finally getting my life turned around with psychotherapy and SSRIs. That legitimates it much more, and it makes it easier for the entrepreneur to normalize the experience of having these mental health symptoms.
It's interesting, as somebody who suffers from anxiety and depression, when I was younger, this is not something you talked about. So it's funny that one talks about that now, which is kind of cool. But to your point, it's now it's talked about, but that doesn't mean that anything's happening. And what I find particularly surprising is, by implication, and the way you're bringing this up suggests, I think we've all lost our minds over the last 2 years at some point. One of my best friends who listens to this show was like, I'm super introverted, but after about 6 months, he's like, I need to get outside. I think we all have learned in the last 2.5 years that mental health kind of matters. And are you saying that basically as soon as the door opens, the front door opens, you walk outside the house, it's sort of, have we not learned anything, do you think, from this little experience? Or do you think we've actually learned something?
I think that role models and encouragement make a big difference. I think that when celebrities talk about their mental health issues, it makes it a lot easier for other people to see it as being natural. And you're right about the pandemic. Mental health utilization went up anywhere from 50 to 100% in different communities during the pandemic. It was just terrible for emotional well-being.
But then has it dipped?
I haven't followed those statistics, but I can tell you, no matter where in the world you are, it's very hard to find a therapist.
I'm in the wrong business. I also like the idea, and I don't think you necessarily said it this way, but what it sparked in me is, I was thinking, as I'm building my company and starting to raise, I was thinking of writing almost like an investor manifesto, which is like, here's how we're going to treat each other. Maybe that's insane. I don't know.
But you've got the beginning of a good idea.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. No, I like the concept. My way of thinking about it is, why are you the right investor for us, and why are we the right company for you?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I like your idea. I mean, you didn't say this, but interestingly, you the dichotomy of the two investor prototypes or the archetypes that you mentioned, I like the idea. You could almost do like a litmus test to see which one they are by like, hey, are you going to put a mental health budget? And if they say, are you insane? You're like, I know which kind of investor you are. As we move into this new sort of pseudo recessional time where people are less willing to part with their capital, like it's becoming clear that, or at least I had a chat with a VC in our ecosystem that was like, hey, if I can put my money in a bank and I can get 5% interest, and now maybe depending on what your Fed does, 6% interest on an account just by keeping my money in the bank. Getting venture, I imagine, will be harder, because why would you take risk capital? If I was an LP, a limited partner, investing in venture capital, I could just put my money in a bond and just wait. And I know it'll come back at the other end. What that results in, I think, is I almost picture in my head like investors were being browbeaten by entrepreneurs who had a lot of power. And all of a sudden, the dynamic has changed. Hopefully not to the way it was, in the sense that there's like predatory investors preying on entrepreneurs, but the dynamic has changed. How should an entrepreneur think about that? How should they treat investors who are also, I think, calibrating, because it's not over yet, but calibrating the new power that they've received and how much less the entrepreneur has in it? Is there any tips that you have, or what you've seen in the last, say, 3 months as we're unfolding with this stuff? Have you noticed any patterns that are working or not working for entrepreneurs?
One thing to keep in mind is that the vast majority of businesses do not have investors. the investor who I like the most, who coaches me on various issues, he says that the best company is the company that has no investors and it has great product market fit, and the company is accountable to the customers instead of to the investors. And that's really the way it should be. So, translating that into the way of thinking of people who are circling around the margins of the venture capital community, I would say, like, think of a business that doesn't need investors. Why do you need investors in the first place? Investors are a big hassle. They put you under a lot of pressure. They need quick returns. They're not patient. They can't think strategically. They're going to badger you to do what they think is right, even if it's not really right for the business. You have all kinds of like legal obligations and commitments that come with it. So really think twice before you accept money from investors, and see if you can formulate a business model that doesn't require them at all. If you can, you've got a real business. A lot of these venture-backed companies are not real businesses. They're imaginary businesses. They churn, they have transactions happening, they have teams, they have visibility, but they're not real businesses. They're just burning up runway. And the hopes that they can become a real business before you get to the end of the runway. And most of them don't. So think about making a real business. And if you can and you're getting traction with it, then investors will be much more inclined to recognize the true value of what you've created.
That's a great point. And I think, and perhaps a point to wind down on, which is, there's this fetishization of startups. And when I think the term startup has been co-opted a little bit. Startup to me means a high growth technology company or something like a technology company, as opposed to being an entrepreneur, which you can run a startup if you're an entrepreneur, or you can sell hats on Shopify. That is also an entrepreneur, but they're not the same kind of animal. But there's a fetishization of venture capital, and that is if you're not doing that, then you're not cool, and that's not the one of the, you know what I mean? So you just say, especially now that the times are changing, hey, take a deep breath. Look at what happened over the last, 10 years since the last recession, and take notes and compare. Like, you don't need to be one of 9 out of 10 chances you're going to fail if you're doing the venture style. Is that kind of how you're thinking about it, or where you're going?
Yes. And entrepreneurs were around a long time before investors were too.
That's fair. Do you think, but like from a mental health perspective, do you find that those entrepreneurs who don't take money or take money when they need it for good reason kind of thing, do they have different mental health outcomes or profiles?
One of the things I've discovered is that a lot of entrepreneurs have low self-esteem. They talk a big game, but the imposter syndrome is a real thing, and it's connected with self-doubt, low self-worth, and part of the drive to be on Twitter and to be covered by TechCrunch and all that is that it's validating for you as an individual. But it's validating because there's this void inside that needs to be filled up by extrinsic recognition. What I would say is, let's separate that from business decisions. If you're the keynote speaker, and if you're flying around to South by Southwest, and if you're bringing on investors when you don't really need to, or the wrong kind of investors just because you want to close a big round or something, that should be for business reasons, not because it helps you feel good about yourself and it helps you project a certain image out there into the world. Many of the small business owner operators are not driven to the same extent by that motivation. And they have more practical business ideas. And some of them scale, but when it scales, what that means is you had one store and now you have 5 stores. It doesn't mean that you're going global and you're having a global supply chain and your website communicates in 6 languages and you're doing, machine learning to come up with analytics that'll help you target the customers you need to reach in Indonesia or something like that.
So I think the TLDR from that was you could raise a gigantic grant from a well-known venture capitalist to fill the self-esteem hole, or you could invest in a psychiatrist who takes none of your company and it's way less expensive for better self-esteem outcomes. Right?
And it doesn't even have to be investing in a psychiatrist. It can be maintaining the relationships with 3, 5, 10 people who know you well and love you, who have the kind of love that is unconditional. Because all of the admiration you get out there in the marketplace is quite conditional.
And fleeting. Well, that's great. Well, that is a really nice, upbeat way to end this show, which is really weird for this show. So thanks for coming on, Michael. We really appreciate it.
Before we sign off, I just want to commend you personally for caring about the issue of the well-being and mental health of entrepreneurs, and for thinking of them as people rather than as good bets.
The BetaKit podcast is produced by BetaKit Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.